non non-economic ones, that is. Then I'm actually going to go through and look at what the consequences would be, and I'm going to give a little spoiler alert here. The consequences are not pretty. Next slide, please. The East China Sea is one possible conflict, is one possible hotspot, and there are multiple in the East China Sea, but the one I want to focus on briefly here are the Senkaku Diao Islands. This is a small set of islands, uninhabited, basically just a collection of rocks in the East China Sea off the northeast of Taiwan there, as you can see from the map. But this is a significant set of rocks. They've been claimed by China since going back to the 14th century. They were then conquered by Japan at the end of the 19th century in the First Sino-Japanese War. Then, following Japan's defeat in 1945, the end of World War II, the United States assumed custodialship of the islands before transferring them back to Japan in accordance with the Okinawa Reversion Agreement in 1972, I believe. And tensions have escalated from there. In 2013, China effectively claimed the islands, announcing an aerial defense identification zone, which is essentially claiming the airspace over the islands and monitoring and reserving the right to engage any Japanese aircraft that enter that airspace. China's also conducted regular marine operations around the islands, coming into confrontation, not military confrontation, but coming into confronting Japanese vessels along the way. Why is this significant? This is significant because the United States and Japan have a collective security treaty in place dating back to 1960, such that if a shooting match were to break out between China and Japan over the islands, the US could potentially be brought in, and bad things could transpire from there. So that's one possible hotspot in the East China Sea. Next slide, please. South China Sea has received more attention. Read about, if you track the news, developments between China and its neighbors. Mostly what you see are stories about what's taking place in the South China Sea. Number of hotspots here, but the one that I'll just briefly highlight is the one between the Philippines and China. The Scarborough Shoal is a collection of reefs, was claimed by China, established dominion over the reefs in 2013, and then moved 2012, and then in 2013 moved to also claim the second Thomas Shoal, both of which are hotly disputed by the Philippines. And over the course of Chinese patrols, Coast Guard patrols of the reefs, they have come into regular contact with Philippine vessels. This image is from earlier this year, and features a Chinese Coast Guard firing a water cannon upon a Philippine vessel off the coast of the second Thomas Shoal. Why is this significant? Again, because the United States has a collective security agreement with the Philippines dating back to 1951, such that if a shooting match were to develop between China and the Philippines, the US could be drawn in. The US is also actively, under the current Marcos government, expanding US military presence in the Philippines, which is also increasing the risk of US aircraft and naval assets coming into confrontation with China in the region. Next slide, please. And of course, the most immediate threat of conflict is that of Taiwan. President Xi's ascension to power in 2012 marked a notable uptick in tensions. Shortly after his inauguration, he delivered the now notable Great Rejuvenation speech, in which he set forth this policy. China would seek to become a leading power by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China, and made clear from the beginning that a central component of attainment of China's great national rejuvenation is the integration of reintegration of Taiwan.
I'm reading here from the major Bangladeshi newspaper, the Daily Star.
Okay, thank you. So in 2022, tensions further escalated with Nancy Pelosi, then House Speaker's visit to Taiwan. China, in response, this was in August of 2022, China immediately thereafter initiated a series of unprecedented military exercises, which led to speculation in the West that a direct conflict between the United States and China would be inevitable over Taiwan. The gentleman featured here in the photo is General Michael Minahan, the leader of the United States Air Mobility Command. And he, again, now famously or infamously, depending on how you view it, predicted in the beginning of 2023 that the United States and China would be in a direct war, become involved in direct war over Taiwan by 2025, so next year. He also gave the order to his troops to prepare accordingly. Next slide, please. So now we've identified four possible pathways. Haig mentioned the economic route to war. I've highlighted for you three possible hotspots over geographic disputes in the East and South China Seas. So the big question now, the $64,000 question, is how would a war with China actually play out? What would it look like? What would its consequences be? And well, fortunately, we don't have any real-world data from which to draw. Hopefully it remains that way. But what we do have are war game simulations, the vast majority of which are classified. But over the last 3 years, two major open source war game simulations have come out. And I am going to draw from both of them. I'm actually going to walk through and summarize both of them for you now to draw a picture of what conflict might look like. I should note at the beginning that I am going to be focusing on the costs to the United States, not the costs to China, though I assure you that those would be equally grave. Next slide, please. The first simulation was conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the leading US think tanks, and it crafted its simulation, or envisioned constructed its simulation around the scenario that China launches, for whatever reason, an amphibious invasion, full-scale amphibious invasion of Taiwan in the year 2026. The format of the game is there are 4 players, the United States and China being the two major ones, but also Taiwan, of course, and Japan as a pivotal US ally. Capabilities are assumed to be very generous. Assumption is that both the United States and China would have full access to large stores of advanced capabilities in the year 2026. Now that's a somewhat dubious assumption, particularly in light of dwindling US stores as a result of the conflicts in Ukraine and Israel. But favorable assumption for the United States here that they would have full access to their full stores of long and intermediate range missiles. Strategy based on historical, I won't go into that. Important feature of this game is that there is no possibility for nuclear escalation. That's simply removed to assess how a purely conventional conflict would play out. And the game was run 22 times to see how various strategies might play out. Next slide, please. And basically, the game plays out in all 22 iterations. I've essentially distilled how the major points of how the game plays out, irrespective of specific strategy differences in the various iterations. And essentially what happens is that the game begins with a massive Chinese bombardment of Taiwan, which effectively destroys Taiwanese naval and air power, effectively nullifying their ability to, in any meaningful way, ward off a Chinese invasion. China then encircles the island and cuts off external supply lines. This removes the possibility of a Ukraine-type strategy where the United States would effectively fight through Taiwan as a proxy, arming them, but not engaging directly with U.S. military power, U.S. military forces, I should say. This is a scenario that's talked about. I hear talked about in the strategic community, but this game simulation clearly shows that this strategy would be very difficult, if not impossible, in light of Taiwan's geographic characteristics. U.S. submarine and air power then engage China directly and inflict massive damage on Chinese amphibious forces, making its actual consolidation of power once it reaches the Taiwanese shores very difficult. China also, depending on the simulation, either before or after the US engagement, conducts a massive bombing campaign on US bases in Japan, effectively significantly impairing US naval forces and limiting its air power projection capacity. And assuming Taiwan persists in the fight, this is another key assumption that the game makes, that Taiwan will, in full-throated fashion, fight to the end. China's ultimate invasion is unsuccessful in that they conquer the entire island. However, all sides take very heavy losses, and the US global position is significantly damaged moving forward as a result of loss of massive military assets. Next slide, please. So let's look at what that loss of major military assets actually comprises. In all simulations, China conducts devastating strikes on US bases in Japan and in Guam, which is, of course, US territory. The simulation does not discuss what might happen to US bases in the Philippines, but one can only assume that those would be bombed as well, and even more US assets and military treasure, not to mention, of course, personnel, would be lost there. But just assuming that the bombing campaigns are restricted to China, to Japan and Guam, the US loses anywhere from 7 to 20 major surface ships, these are destroyers, etc., as well as at least 2 major aircraft carriers. And in most of the simulations, it was more like 5 to 10. US sustains enormous damage to its air power, losing anywhere from 200 to 500 aircraft. Again, most of the simulations are more in the vicinity of 500. Only very conservative US strategies involve lower losses of aircraft. Combination of Chinese missile and cyber capabilities cause major impairment to US intelligence and command and control infrastructure. This is C4ISR, command control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, which is the think of the brain of the US military apparatus. With sufficiently significant impairment to C4ISR capabilities, the US military effectively becomes brain dead, leaving troops vulnerable to devastating strikes, which is exactly what happened in most of these simulations. The US suffers thousands of casualties more in the first few weeks than in 20 years of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars combined. Next slide, please. So the takeaway, in all simulations where the assumptions that I identified hold, intense fighting occurs with thousands of strikes and counterstrikes between Chinese and American forces. US missile defense systems, this is another important point to highlight. Highly touted US missile defense systems repeatedly prove vulnerable to being overwhelmed by Chinese missile capabilities, as well as just simply being vulnerable to penetration. US suffers air losses greater than anything since the Vietnam War and greater than anything since World War II. And combination of personnel and asset losses, combination of personnel and asset losses is sufficiently grave to cause, quote, and I quote directly from the report here, tremendous damage to the US global position for many years following the confrontation. Basically, the report doesn't go this far, but implies that the US could be knocked out of the ranks of the major military powers as a result of the losses it could sustain over the course of a purely conventional conflict with China. And success, basically, there would be no meaningful winner. China would not succeed in its goals, but the cost of actually fully conquering Taiwan, but the cost to the United States of preventing it from achieving those goals would be so high as to render any quote unquote victory for the United States purely Pyrrhic. Next slide, please. The CNES simulation, this is the Center for a New American Security, another major US think tank. This one was founded in 2005 by Michelle Flournoy, for those of you who know her, Biden's possible pick she was a leading contender for the position of Secretary of Defense in 2020. Did not get the position, but remains committed to advancing US power by military means. Her think tank conducted a simulation in 2023, in 2022, excuse me, this one came out, the report came out in 2023, but the initial summary was released in 2022. And this simulates a Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan in 2027. And the format here is basically just to focus on US and China, how things would play out. Taiwan, Japan, Australia are represented, but they're not meaningful strategic players to the game. Again, the assumptions about capabilities are very optimistic, and that Taiwan is competent militarily and will commit to fighting to the bitter end. And here, nuclear weapons are in play, and we'll see why that's significant in just a moment. And this scenario just runs a single simulation of the game. Next slide, please. So the game synopsis, basically how it plays out is China faces an initial dilemma, whether to just focus on decapitating Taiwan or whether to strike US forces and try and degrade their capabilities in a kind of preemptive strike, which is what it actually does in the game. China launches a massive air and naval campaign to significantly degrade, effectively destroy Chinese capabilities, as well as strike US bases in Guam and cause significant damage. US responds with submarine and long-range airstrikes. This is because, in light of China's now excellent short and intermediate range missile capabilities, the United States is forced to rely on strikes from a distance, cannot get anywhere near the vicinity of the island without being immediately vulnerable to devastating Chinese missile strikes. There's a heavy exchange of fire with heavy losses on both sides, and this game really, it also comes out in the CSIS simulation, but this single iteration really shows how significant or how critical the amount of stores, missile stores, will be in a fight. Both sides, and again, this is assuming the most generous conditions, namely large missile stores, both sides start running out of munitions, start struggling with munition stores after the first week of conflict, at which point neither side has any definitive military advantage. And then a key feature of this game is that escalation is rapid, and I'll get into that with the next slide. So this is a really critical point, and this game really clearly shows how quickly and uncontrollably a conflict could ratchet up the escalation ladder. Basically, escalatory strikes were not just conducted for purely offensive grounds, but were deemed a military necessity. And what I mean by this was China was put in a position such that if it did not strike Chinese bases in Japan and Guam, which is again territorial United States, it would be at a decisive military disadvantage, and its ability to actually invade Taiwan would be severely undermined, such that it was necessary, or at least in the view of those strategic thinkers on the Chinese side in the game, it was necessary to strike these bases, which essentially precipitated this steady march up the escalation ladder. The US responded to those strikes on Japan and Guam with cruise missile strikes on Chinese ships in Chinese port, so striking mainland China. China responded with strikes on Hawaii, and US bases in Australia and the Philippines. The US countered with strikes on China's Eastern Theater Command in Nanjing. This was a really critical step in the escalation ladder, attacking China's command and control infrastructures on mainland China. In response, China was not able to do so in this game, but under real-world conditions, it's very likely it would be able to strike the continental United States, California in particular, Los Angeles and San Francisco, and China ultimately detonated a tactical nuclear weapon off the coast of Hawaii, and that's how the game ended. Next slide, please. So the major takeaways from this game are that any quick victory by the United States or China is effectively impossible. What is destined to happen is that the two sides become locked in a protracted conflict, which sets the stage for rapid and uncontrollable escalation, which is exactly what happened. Next slide, please. So the bottom line, how might a China-US conflict play out? And essentially, it is all but guaranteed to be a bloody mess with terrible losses on both sides without any clear strategic winner. And secondly, assuming conflict can be kept below the nuclear threshold, which is a dubious assumption as the CNAS simulation clearly bore out, escalation is, the possibility for rapid and uncontrollable escalation is there and is acute. Next slide, please. I think I will skip this portion on possible remedies in light of time constraints. but I'm happy to delve into these in the question and answer period. Next slide, please. Okay, so conclusion. Possible conflict scenarios, there are multiple potential flashpoints which become ever more tinderbox-like as tensions between China and the United States continue to rise. Possible conflict consequences are catastrophic. They range from absolutely terrible to existential, the worst case scenario. So have to be avoided at all costs if we want to maintain a halfway decent quality of life moving forward. And the possible remedies, again, I'm happy to go into those in the Q&A, but I will not discuss those now. Next slide, please. Thank you so much.
Haig, you're muted.
All right, I would like to add a disclaimer. The material in our presentations reflects the work of the GPAC's committee. The Green Party platform doesn't speak to relations between the US and China, so we are not speaking for the Green Party of the United States, but we're providing this information for the benefit of Greens, and we certainly believe that this issue will be a part of the campaign of the Green Party presidential candidate. So we would like to open the floor to questions. Raise your hand and we will unmute you, or put a question in the chat if you would prefer to do that.
Looks like there's already one in the chat. What about Star Wars capabilities?
Well, either Ryan and I could address that. The history of the missile defense program has not been full of success. We have a very limited deployment of interceptors in Alaska, I believe. And in test intercepts, they've scored about 50%. And this is against theoretical incoming missiles that don't necessarily represent the capabilities of an adversary. For decades, the program has been challenged by not demonstrating success against realistic incoming missiles. There's a basic problem in missile defense, which is that the attacker can concentrate force, but the defender has to defend everywhere. So this opens the way to what's called a saturation attack, where even if you have missile intercept capabilities, say around San Francisco, what if the attacker concentrates on Los Angeles or Honolulu? And it becomes economically infeasible to create an impenetrable dome over even small areas. The other issue is the attackers have evolved much more sophisticated missile penetration strategies, which include generating a swarm of decoys, which have the same radar and infrared characteristics as the incoming warhead. So now you're not looking at one incoming blip, you're looking at 20. And standard doctrine for firing interceptor missiles is 2 for each incoming missile, because that gets your intercept probabilities up past 95%. So here you are potentially looking at a swarm of incoming targets in a saturation attack. And even if we had a perfected defense, it could still be overwhelmed. And the final complication is that adversaries are now introducing maneuverable warheads, which change course as they arrive, and most intercept technologies rely on a predictable ballistic course that you can use to position your interceptor. So basically, we're defenseless against nuclear missile attack. The chances of a successful intercept are modest, and it would be unaffordable even if we could perfect it. So it's really a kind of placebo and a source of infinite funding for that sector of the defense establishment. And Ryan, feel free to add if you have some more commentary on that.
No, basically, you've touched upon the three major problems with missile defense. There are more, but the three major ones are that, one, missile defense, it's almost always the case, and certainly would be the case in the context of a US-China conflict, that the adversary has sufficient missile projectile capabilities to just simply overwhelm a system, even a fully functioning system. That's problem one. Problem two is that there are capabilities which China possesses which are simply invulnerable to missile defense. Advanced cruise missile capabilities, ballistic missile capabilities, etc. And these are able to penetrate US missile defenses even under the most favorable conditions. And then the third is that these decoy strategies, which you referenced, Haig, can simply confuse the system. We actually saw this back in April with Iran's attack on Israel and the use of Shahed drones to attract the attention of the Israeli Iron Dome system as well as US auxiliary forces, and effectively exhaust significant missile defense capabilities, while then following with multiple waves of strikes, which the latter of which were able to strike their targets. So missile defense, I agree with Haig entirely, is a placebo.
So there's another question from the chat about commenting on US and Chinese shipbuilding and repair capacity. Could either one of you comment on that?
Yeah, I can briefly speak to that. A colleague of mine from Germany just gave a presentation on this. And basically, the major takeaway here is that China's capacity to produce ships vastly exceeds that of the United States. For the amount of time, if I recall from her presentation, I think for every one ship the United States builds, China's producing somewhere in the vicinity of 5 to 10. So China has an enormous advantage in production of naval assets, which will be very significant in a conflict scenario involving Taiwan, for instance. The actual battle space would overwhelmingly be naval and air power.
Hi, do you want to comment, or there's one more question in the chat, and then Logan has his hand up. Do you want to comment on this, or do you want the next question?
I would just briefly note that the era of the naval surface combatant is likely drawing to a close. But although the Chinese can probably match or exceed our shipbuilding capacity, the remaining strength the US has in this conflict would be the submarine force, which is still the most advanced in the world, and it would sink a lot of ships and do a tremendous amount of damage. But as Ryan's presentation points out, it basically would be a slugfest with roughly equal damage on both sides and no clear advantageous outcome.
All right, the last question from the chat is a question about how to get the US Congress to hear this excellent presentation.
That is an excellent question, because although the Vox Populi is not well heeded these days, the power of lobbyists remains, and the potential lobbying power of the non-defense US corporations is many multiples that of the defense sector. And Ryan and I have discussed over many months why the corporations that have the most to lose are silent as this march toward a disastrous war continues. I think they will awaken eventually as these economic sanctions continue to damage their interests. And that's when Congress will be restrained from putting more fuel on this fire. Maybe Ryan has something further to comment on that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I really don't. I think that I hope I'm wrong. I sincerely hope I'm wrong, but I tend to share Haig's assessment that I think it's going to take a catastrophic incident, a catastrophic failure of current US policy to induce a meaningful change. The one possible hope, as Haig and I see it, is that the corporate sector, the high-tech sector, so on, commands a substantially larger portion of the, or contributes, accounts for a substantially larger proportion of US GDP, as Haig's slide pointed out, wakes up and effectively says, we're not okay with this policy course anymore. It's too dangerous and it's too damaging of our bottom lines, which is of course what corporations really care about. So that's the one glimmer of hope as I see it, that there could be a kind of confrontation between the MIC and what Haig and I call the broader corporate sector. Other than that, I think it's going to take, I don't think this current policy agenda is going to change, barring a major catastrophe larger than, of a greater scale than the catastrophic failures we saw in Afghanistan and now Ukraine.
Hey. You want Logan, I guess.
Okay, it was great, just awesome presentations, Ryan and Haig, very, very good. One point of clarification, and then I have like a two-pronged question or for discussion. When Nixon went to China, he was not only trying to divide China from Russia, it was trying to divide the communist world against Vietnam. It was at the height of the Vietnam War, and that was one of the major goals, is to try to at least get China and Russia to back away from what was going on in Vietnam. I think, one of my first part of the question is just the world stage. It seems like we've come full circle. If the goal was to divide China and Russia, our current policy is driving them together. And we have a hot war in the Ukraine and Russia, and we have the situation in the Middle East. And so I think we have to really look at the overall world picture to assess where things might go. The other part is how, we have this peace movement that's coming out of the war on Gaza, and what role, I think that's where the hope is. I have no hope in the corporate sector changing its imperialist policy at all. But if there's any hope, it's with the peace movement and what role the Green Party. It seems like this convention is very critical in Jill's campaign to challenging the whole issue of American foreign policy. So those are two-pronged points of discussion.
Well, I'll start with the issue of the Russia-China alliance. This
Just 1 minute. You have 10 minutes. We have 10 minutes left in the workshop. I'm supposed to give a warning.
It's been an article of the geopolitical faith for some time. There was a strategist named Mackinder who said that the key to controlling the world is what he called the world island, which is the Eurasian landmass. And the two big players on it are now in a very strong alliance. So this flies in the face of all conventional wisdom about US foreign policy. And the only explanation I can find for what most observers would call an enormous blunder is this intoxication of exceptionalism, that the US believes that it can break any rule, cross any boundary because we're invincible. And this is a very dangerous kind of belief. We saw it lead to the destruction of the Axis powers in World War II. Both of them believed that there was something mystical and omnipotent in their national spirit, which could nullify any kind of statistics or material facts that would undermine their warlike policies. And if we've really succumb to this, then we're headed for a terrible, terrible outcome. Regarding the peace movement, I think it's incumbent on Jill or whoever our presidential candidate is to bring to the fore all of these dangers. And I guess that's the only hope for the democratic process.
And there was a question in the chat about whether GPACs could put forward a plank on this for the GPUP platform. So we can come back to that.
Logan's got his hand up again.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed at GPACs getting a resolution to the National Party after the convention sometime about this.
Okay. Still have time, Ryan. Did you want to weigh in on the question?
Sure. With regard to the first prong, yeah, I think it's quite clear the United States violated fundamental principles of balance of power politics, and that its approach to Ukraine has, and now Israel as well, has driven not just Russia and China, its two major principal competitors, together, but other powers as well, Iran, North Korea, and significantly, key regions of the world. One of the most important regions being Southeast Asia. I had the opportunity to spend 2 months in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, earlier this year, and put my finger on the pulse of public opinion in ASEAN nations. I was in Singapore, I was in Indonesia, spoke with Malaysian experts, and there is a perception now that not China, but rather the United States is the key threat to their national prosperity, and that the concern being it's the United States that's going to provoke a conflict with China and try and draw them in. Countries like Singapore, countries like Indonesia are moving more in the direction of non-alignment and making it clearer and clearer that they are not allies of the United States. They engage in security cooperation with the United States, but they are not allies. Singapore expressly states this: we are not an ally of the United States. So the United States is doing itself no favors at all from a strategic perspective. And with regard to the peace movement, I want to clarify the point I made about the corporate sector earlier. This is not that Apple and Intel and so on are nice, idealistic guys who are interested in a more peaceful world. The point being that they are concerned about the effects of growing US competition with China on their bottom lines. Haig's presentation made clear the already adverse effects and the potential for truly catastrophic effects for the US economy moving forward, and that this is why they might use their tremendous leverage i.e. wealth, to alter the US foreign policy course. I do not, unfortunately, have much faith in the peace movement in the United States or even around the world. I think it's very divided, and I think it just simply does not have the impact to make any kind of meaningful, to impact US foreign policy in any meaningful way, unfortunately. Hope that changes, but as of presently, I don't see it as a major player in these dynamics at all.
Here we have 4 minutes left in the workshop, so I don't know. I hand it over to you, Haig, to say what will happen next.
Well, I'd just like to add a note to Ryan's comment. The ability of a lobbying group to quickly remove a congressional representative has been demonstrated recently. AIPAC, the very powerful pro-Israel lobby, took down 2 Democratic Congress men and women by pouring, I think it was 15 million and 10 million into the 2 elections. So for a major corporation, this is lunch money. This is trivial money. The average congressional seat campaign costs it is not much more than $1 million, and a couple of multiples of that for the Senate. So in a plutocracy where $1 is 1 vote, these corporations, when they decide to move, can change the government. It's just a matter of what their threshold of pain is. So we will find out. On the other hand, ideologies, once they take hold, can be extremely resistant, even to overwhelming economic pressure. The business interests of Germany and Japan flourished briefly from war profits, and then were utterly devastated by defeat in the war. And I hope we don't go down that path.
Ryan?
I don't have any additional comments other than just to thank everyone once again for your attendance and for this discussion. Really enjoyed it.
Yes, and as your late arriving host, I'd like to do the
Yes,
same.
and I should say also thank you, Madeline, as well for your role as chair today.
I should point out, we'll be making these slides available on the GPAC's website and to anyone that wants to request them.
All right, then. So are there any last questions or comments? If not, then we can say goodbye and shut off the recording. But if so, there might be, if there's one more, we can take it. Hearing none. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And have a great convention. This is potentially an historic weekend coming up.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. And hi, can you turn off the recordings, please? Or was that Ryan that started it?
It was not I.
Because I don't have the capability of stopping